Hello students. We are now doing module 4 unit 3. The last session was all about gender. We looked at gaze, male gaze, female gaze and representation of gender in cinema. We also looked at how creative industries is sort of appropriating with gender paradigms. Today we will look at the next section, Unit 3, which is on class, caste and religion in Indian cinema. Although I'm saying Indian cinema, I do want to look a little more at the larger picture of cinema and how class gets represented. So, 3 sections. We're going to look at 3 different sections. First, let's look at class. Do you remember those old films that you watched, popular films, where you had a male protagonist and the male protagonist falls in love with a heroine or a she-hero? So they both belong to 2 different classes. Either the hero comes from a rich family and the heroine from a poor family, or the other way around. And then they fall in love, they go through a lot of problems because they belong to 2 different classes. And the film ends with them coming together, sort of breaking those barriers of class. And the whole, the villainy, the people, the person, or the film sort of identifies one person as the villain. The film would identify this one person as the reason for creating all this kind of problems for the two lovers. Now, that was a very simplistic way of addressing the class divide. It is never a single villain. Class is a very huge barrier. Class divide or belonging to different classes is a huge barrier for anyone to sort of fall in love and get married. Breaking those barriers are not easy. So you would have seen a lot of such films in popular cinema especially, where you symbolically put one person as the villain. And just by eliminating the villain, you find the solution. The crisis is resolved. Now, this is a very good example of films that represent class divide, but not realistic, of course. And in realistic films, you would see that the class divide separates the lovers. Again, it was quite simplistic. But there were films which talked about of the same class division from a very good perspective, very deep perspective, mostly art cinema, like films of Mrinal Sen, or even films, although Satyajit Ray's films don't really talk about the divide, but try to depict the lives of the poorer sections. So when it comes to depiction of poverty, we did have a lot of films earlier which looked at the lower sections of society. But with neoliberalism and globalization in contemporary times, you don't really see a lot of poor people on screen. There are fewer films that talk about the poorer classes. Now, a film that I would like to talk about here is the film Parasite. You might have seen it, and it was a film that suddenly sort of brought this class back into the picture. The film looked at the lower sections of society and worked on the concept of being a precariat, or the idea of precarity. So in contemporary times, when you talk about class depiction, I think this is one aspect which looks really interesting and important to discuss in cinema. Now, precarity is a very difficult condition to exist. So in Parasite, you have this person who's living the life of a precariat, who aspires to be rich and is not able to be so. Something very striking in that film is the whole world of the olfactory senses. How it tries to sort of express this divide using smell. If you have watched the movie, you would remember what I am talking about. You have the driver who comes from very poor, circumstances, and the driver supposedly smells. And this is something that keeps coming back in the conversation. It's part of the identity of this driver and his whole family that they stink. So precarious lives of the lower sections in society in a neoliberal world is probably a very interesting dimension that is discussed in cinema. Or even a film like Joker, in fact, talks about the frustrations, the anger, the deep despair of a precariat. There are no ways to climb up the ladder. The cinema very clearly states that. So it creates a kind of insecurity, and it creates instability. It creates fragmented selves. It creates schizophrenic individuals. And Joker captures it all really well. So these films are just a couple of examples of how class gets depicted, especially the lower class. So how do you depict class? One is, of course, through spatial identity. I'm sure you remember these films that I mentioned right now. How do they represent space? Parasite especially, there has been a lot of research. People have written about how spaces are constructed, how the whole idea of climbing up and down the steps become very symbolic. If you look at Malayalam cinema also, you would see this kind of class hierarchies very clearly represented using spaces. There are several tropes to help us understand spaces. So class is one of the dimensions that cinema, one of the themes that cinema tries to portray. Often problematic, often problematic because of the absence of certain classes, sometimes unrealistically represented, but is still one of the prominent themes that you would see in cinema. Can you think of any films here? I was actually thinking of Peoply Live, another film which kind of talks about class, caste and everything. Now, another aspect that I need to talk about here is, of course, caste hierarchy. So caste is another theme that we should probably be discussing in Indian cinema. Caste, of course, you will not see representation in world cinema, but in Indian cinema, how has caste been represented? Now, one very interesting essay that you can probably refer to is Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak?, which talks about the question of agency and subjectivity. In this context, this is very relevant. Because when it comes to subaltern identities, Dalit identities, and representing them on screen, there are questions that one needs to ask. The most important is, who is talking about them? Who is making films about Dalits? So should we give this authority to somebody else? There is every possibility that they may not be able to do justice. They may not be able to depict the community in the right way. They may try to sometimes ridicule them and maybe belittle them. Sometimes they may even show them as victims because they do not belong to the caste, they do not belong to the community, and they do not understand the reality of that existence as the subaltern. Now remember, this does not work the other way around because the privileged will always be able to use their voice. They will be able to articulate for themselves. But the subaltern, the marginalized, the other in a society will always find it difficult to find their voice because it takes a while for, you need to be empowered to actually speak up for themselves. So here, when it comes to caste representation, one often sees that the caste that is mostly represented, or the caste that sort of finds itself represented as this homogeneous Hindu or whatever, is usually the upper caste. It's usually the Brahminical caste that we see as being represented as the Hindu. We can safely say Hindu because when it comes to caste identities, it's mostly Hindu identity. So if you remember the old Malayalam movies, you would see that the films were all about mostly upper class, not upper class, but mostly upper caste Hindus, even though they were in the lower class because probably they had lost their wealth and all of that. The stories usually revolved around how they lost their wealth or how they were trying to regain their wealth. So it was always about the upper caste. And if you remember the language that was used in these films, it was all the Savarna language. The Malayalam that they were talking was mostly Savarna and belonged to a particular area in a particular locality in Kerala. This is true of other parts of the country as well. The caste system is so present everywhere, is so pervasive everywhere that one does not even think about this caste hierarchy while one is watching a movie and sort of internalizes that the Dalits are absent, that Dalits do not have a voice. One is not even aware. Now, earlier films would use, dark-skinned characters as sidekicks or sometimes for humor and all of that. Dark-skinned, curly-haired characters were used as sidekicks or, sometimes as the villainous characters, sidekicks to the villain and so on. It's only in very recent times that people have started realizing the absence of Dalit characters, the absence of Dalit filmmakers, the absence of Dalit technicians. Even now, in popular Hindi film industry, there are very few people who belong to the Dalit community. One area of the country, especially Tamil Nadu, which has sort of taken it forward very well, and we do have filmmakers like Paranjit trying to create a space for themselves and making films which are very meaningful. Now, remember the question that I asked in the beginning about agency. That is something that one needs to remember. When it comes to subaltern identities, there is this whole question of agency. Who is making that film? So in Malayalam, there are very few films of this kind. Again, very problematic. And the positioning is also very problematic. So these films sort of perpetuate this epistemic violence against the subaltern because there is no voice that is given to them, but the voice is denied to them. So also the question of Dalits having a homogeneous identity. When such representations happen, most often the filmmakers forget that Dalits are also a community which is so varied, and across the country they have very different kinds of practices, very different belief systems, and therefore such attempts to homogenize them is also a kind of violence against them. So cinema needs to understand this, filmmakers need to understand this uniqueness as well, the uniqueness of every individual Dalit communities. So representation of the subaltern community in the film industry is still very minimal, especially if you look outside of Tamil Nadu. And therefore, the films are also not really doing justice to these communities. Can you think of any film that you probably can try to understand and analyze using the lens provided by people like Gayatri Spivak? You can look at those films from some specific lens. One is, of course, intersectionality. Second is, of course, the question of agency. And third, of course, the authenticity of those voices. These are a few pointers that will help you to read a film from a Dalit perspective, or from the point of view of caste representation. Now, moving on to the third dimension of religion. Now, religion again is an interesting theme in films. There's been a very huge shift in the way in which religious identities are portrayed. Now, how is religion, made into a readable or an understandable theme? How is it marked on an individual or a space? Can you think about the ways in which it happens? Religion is always marked using certain tropes. So if you want to talk about a Hindu character, you would probably want to, put a bindi or, something of that kind. Or if you want to talk about a Christian, a cross, or a Muslim, green color, these are different, tropes. These are different symbols. These are different semiotic codes that you would use to sort of tell us that this person belongs to this community. Sometimes it is also through the use of language. If you remember older Malayalam movies, you might be able to give me examples of that. How the language of an upper caste Hindu, of course, a Hindu was almost always an upper caste Hindu, and the language would be very different from that of a Muslim coming from northern Kerala, or a Christian coming from central Kerala. So even the placing of these characters in different geographical regions itself is very interesting. So religion is often, mentioned in these semiotic codes. And how are they represented? Now, for example, very interesting example, especially very relevant to contemporary India, is the way in which Hindus and Muslims were represented in Hindi films from older times to contemporary times. So Muslim representation is something that is very interesting because it has changed over time. And the relationship between the Hindu and the Muslim has also changed over time. So if you look at earlier Indian cinema, religious identity, especially if the Hindu and the Muslim, was established in a very secular manner. So the whole idea of secularism was the framework within which these different communities were, comfortably placed. So if earlier films talked about bringing communal harmony, even when there was a war between India and Pakistan, this understanding of the Indian Muslim and the Indian Hindu, between the two communities was very much prevalent, in cinema at least. when there were communal riots happening in India between the Hindu and the Muslim, the films tried to address it from a very proactive manner. They tried to bring in harmony between the two. And it was somewhere towards the 1990s that this equation began to change as far as films are concerned. The othering of the Muslim, the Indian Muslim, is something that began to happen there. And so the religious identities became more, clearly visible and more, strikingly visible. And there was a friction between the two, at least in films, even when it was not there outside. So this othering has resulted, the films prefer to look at this othering or try to create this othering and make it a little more sharper and visible. So this has happened over time, and as of now, we see that religious identities are very problematically presented in cinema, especially in mainstream Hindi cinema. This is where regional films ought to be mentioned. In regional cinema, you don't really see this so glaringly present, but religion is still a very important semiotic code in these films. As I said right from the beginning, I have been saying the same thing, that cinema is an ideological product and cinema has to be understood. Any theoretical reading of cinema happens with the understanding that cinema is an ideological product. And cinema will always try to address the hegemonic ideologies, hegemonic discourses that is valid at any particular point in time. And it ought to be understood within the context of nation, within the context of transnational, identities and politics. So we have been talking about caste, religion, and class in cinema. Do read the text that I prescribe and also watch the movies. See you then.